Good evening, everyone, and welcome on behalf of the Aga Khan Youth and Sports Board and the Aga Khan Economic Planning Board to this live podcast event hosted by Perpetuity Podcasts. Perpetuity is a podcast run by two university students, Zakir and Kizzer, both studying economics, supported by AKEPB and AKYSB. It aims to bridge the gap between aspiring talent and industry experts by bringing in industry leaders from all sectors to speak on their journey, the current state of their field, and to offer advice to aspiring talent. Tonight, we are very fortunate to be joined by a fascinating guest. Anthony Gahan is the managing partner and co-founder of Wyvern Partners, Mayfair Investment Bank, who have advised on deals worth over £65 billion, and the founder and deputy chairman of IPSX, the world's first real estate stock exchange. Anthony is an executive fellow at King's College Business School and is its private equity module lead. Prior to Wyvern, Anthony held senior executive and board roles at Lehman Brothers and Robert Fleming & Co. His current sector focus is on business services, media, data, fintech, and industry disruption. Anthony will give a founder's level perspective on serial entrepreneurship, the rise of alternative asset classes, and working on multi-billion-pound mergers and acquisition deals. Without further ado, I'd like to pass it on to our wonderful guest and hosts for this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Zaim, for the introduction. So, as Zaim mentioned, Anthony is a seasoned investment banker, an alternative innovator, a serial entrepreneur. And so I think I'll hand it over to you to sort of introduce yourself in a bit more detail and sort of what you do.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me today. I'm delighted to be here. I'm just a little bit concerned that I'm being seasoned. It sounds as though I've been here for a heck of a long time, which is partly true. And I think some of the history is there. But I guess just a little bit about the career journey. At the time that I was leaving university, which was in the sort of late 80s, everyone wanted to be a banker or a management consultant. And maybe that is still the same, but for only a few people, actually. I don't think anybody really wants to be a banker any longer. But anyway, it was earlier, and I had studied modern languages, so what did I know? And those came in useful over the career in terms of doing transactions, but not particularly useful to understanding how to do deals. Again, this was a different world. Goldman Sachs was a newcomer to London at this point in time. What I eventually joined were merchant banks, not investment banks. And indeed, the merchant bankers in those days were people who, some of them still don't have bowler hats, so I now really do sound seasoned. But they waited at their desk for the phone to ring, for clients to come in and see them and get their professional advice. Meanwhile, Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and all the others were out actually meeting clients. They left their offices to build a much bigger business, and that sadly is probably why the merchant banks are no longer. So my history was I started off doing debt, which is very important, I think, in terms of banking. I did structured finance for a few years. Then I joined a bank called Charterhouse, which was a merchant bank, and then another one called Fleming's, which was founded in 1873 in Dundee as a jute company, which I loved. And then I joined Lehman Brothers. And by the way, all the others don't exist, and frankly, Lehman Brothers doesn't exist either at this point. But you'll be pleased to know, or at least I was pleased to know, that I left Lehman Brothers in 2002, which was several years before my shares would have gone to zero at this point. And then I think the story really starts, because at that point I had come to the conclusion that there must be a better way of doing investment banking, not just having to do the deals that I was told to do with people who I didn't necessarily want to work with. So I thought, well, why don't I start my own firm? So together with two other former colleagues of mine, started Wyvern. We're 21 years in, so that must mean that there's a little bit of longevity in this as well. And we do M&A deals, we do debt deals, we advise on IPOs, we advise management teams on how they get their management incentive package in a private equity deal. So we do quite a lot of things, and thank you for the intro, because that is the day job. Alongside that, I do some teaching. I find that very, very rewarding, truthfully, and that's all about private equity. I have some non-executive roles, and I think we'll talk about this a little bit. At the age of, I think, 50, I did a startup. So I'm afraid no beard, no garage, no nothing like that, but a startup all the same. And I think actually, we'll be talking about entrepreneurship in particular. Entrepreneurs are right at the top of the, if you want, quality set as far as I'm concerned. They are people who are willing to do things that most people are not willing to do. Most people go and have a career, and that's not knocking a career. But if we didn't have entrepreneurs, again, you'll probably ask me the difficult questions in a second, then actually the world would be a much, much worse place to live in. We need entrepreneurs. It's a fundamental requirement of our life going forward. Have I stolen all the questions already?
Maybe just the first one, but it's okay. There's plenty more to come.
Should we talk about entrepreneurs a little bit more?
I think, yeah, let's start with the first question being, for yourself, coming from obviously not a banking background within your education as such, was obviously going into banking the aim for you, and at the end of it was entrepreneurship where you wanted to end up, was owning your own firm like Wyvern where you wanted to end up?
No, I don't think I ever dreamed of being an entrepreneur when I started. So again, it's a different age, and I think these days people are not quite so focused on just doing one thing or another. I teach a lot of people private equity, they're in a business school, but I don't get the sense that all of them want to be bankers, and I rejoice in that as well, because in truth, and hopefully we'll get onto this, it all ties in that banking is sort of interesting, but you're not a good banker, at least in my opinion, unless you have experience that you can apply in transactions, which probably doesn't have anything to do with banking. A lot of it is common sense. A lot of it is communication skills. And what I find is that, again, this is where I really have to give you a little bit of a health warning, because I think that I am not necessarily going to say exactly what everyone else says out of my industry, if you want. But the truth is that unless you have those skills, I don't think that you are a good advisor, because actually banking is about advising people, which is making a judgment call. It's not just about creating the largest model that you can possibly have in Excel, or indeed the largest pack of slides which nobody is ever going to read. But some team has been putting together for probably weeks, normally late at night, before last minute it's changed by the person who's delivering it, and then it's handed out to the client. I'm being controversial already, I think.
And that's what we like.
So you obviously founded Wyvern with your colleagues, but also IPSX, which is the International Property Security Exchange, so the world's first real estate stock exchange. And when we talk about going into entrepreneurship, we talk about going into your bread and butter, what you're an expert at. But how do you even go about making a stock exchange?
No, it's a really good question. As I said earlier, I didn't think that I'd be an entrepreneur. Although I guess starting your own firm is, in a way, sort of stepping out of the mainstream. So over time, I'd been a fintech banker. So I knew a lot about financial technology businesses, and that includes markets, so stock exchanges. And the truth is, I guess, going back to what's an entrepreneur really for me is somebody who is looking at the world and seeking to disrupt in a very positive way. And if you think about this, one of the things that I try and teach is the fact that I think businesses need to reboot like a computer every few years. In the old days, businesses would last for hundreds of years. There are still examples of companies that proudly say, I mean, I talked about Fleming's 1873, great, well, they don't exist at the moment. But there are some businesses that have lasted years and years and years, but the world has changed. Those businesses that have lasted hundreds of years have typically been businesses which have taken many, many years to build in the first place, and their decline, if they are declining and they're not rebooting, takes many, many years as well. Some of you will remember companies like Kodak. Everyone would have been having film, but then digital comes along, and they weren't particularly quick at switching over on this. And today we have businesses that grow like meteors. They start off, and suddenly from nowhere, they're enormous businesses. But what they also have is a much shorter life cycle in many cases, which means that they decline much, much faster than those conventional old-school businesses. So I mention that in terms of, I think every entrepreneur, particularly when they're looking for financing, they'll be asked by the clever folk on the other side of the table, who are the people with the money, so what is it that what do you solve? Why are you here? And what are you putting into all of this? All these questions, which I think are somewhat facile in many cases from investors. But the point about what are you doing is a very valid point. Why are you here? There has to be some sort of reason. And I take this to be part of the reboot, if you want, that needs to happen in industry over and over again. In my case, eventually to answer your question, the real estate industry is a very big industry. In the UK, it's a very interesting industry because we have a very small country relative to others, and land is particularly valuable. It's not necessarily well used in many cases, and there are many deficiencies in the way in which real estate in this country and in other countries is basically allocated. And you think about residential homes, providing people with real homes to live in, it's a problem that we haven't really even started to try and solve. But if you look at real estate, it is also an industry which has not changed in hundreds of years, and there are some industries that are like that. That's not to say that the people in the industry are anything other than very professional. It's just saying that actually this is an industry where not much has really happened. And in recent years, there has been a lot of what's so-called prop tech that comes through, so property technology type things. But most of those are relating to how do you manage real estate. They're almost just technology that will go into a building, make sure that the lights get switched off all the time, that they are safe, all these types of things. All of those great things to happen. But the area that, and this very much ties in with private equity and the other things in terms of alternatives, which I specialize in, is the fact that real estate is only available, institutional real estate is only available as an investment asset class for very, very few people. It's only available to people who are specialist investors in real estate. It's only available to those specialists who have very, very large checkbooks. So we're sitting in this beautiful building that you have here in a prime location in central London, worth a lot of money. So how many people can actually buy a building like this? And based on the fact that real estate, of course, is an asset class which drives yield, everyone understands that, and it shouldn't be correlated with anything else that happens in the world, it's a different type of asset class, it's an interesting one for people, all of us, in this room, thinking, well, can I have a piece of that? And the answer is at the moment, or at least until relatively recently, you couldn't, not very well. You'd have to go and typically be a very high net worth individual or an institution to be able to participate in the lovely institutional real estate market, which is a fund-based market. Yet all of us probably understand real estate much better than many other things. I often say to people, what do you think about Vodafone? And I'm not picking on Vodafone in any particular way, but, well, most people know what Vodafone is. It's a mobile phone business. But is mobile phone business a good business? Well, actually, questionable, because it's a commoditized business. So for growth for Vodafone is much more complicated than many other companies. But so therefore, if you're buying a Vodafone share, you need to understand what on earth you're buying. Now, buying a real estate asset, you'll have a view. Many of those views will be wrong, of course, but you'll have a view because you'll be saying there's a building, you know where the location is, you perhaps know what the tenant base is. Are they good tenants? What are the leases on those things? And basically that gives you an opportunity to look at something which has a yield on it and a capital gain opportunity. So as an asset class, great. The problem is, again, as I said to you, access to this asset class, virtually impossible. So the concept behind IPSX was very simple, which was saying we need to find a way in which people, everybody, can buy buildings. And the only real way to do that is to do it by putting it into a company with shares on a market. And in discussions with the regulatory authorities, eventually, I was encouraged to build the market, very supportive. But unfortunately, when you do these things, you have to build it before you get any revenues out of it. And again, I think this is sort of an interesting point for all entrepreneurs is how do you make the money? How do you get the money? I think this is one of the items we've discussed previously. So should we just talk a little bit about that element of it? I'm conscious that I'm hogging the limelight here.
I know that is the point of the podcast. We'd like to hear your thoughts and your perspectives, but I think it's a great gateway to what we wanted to talk about, which is the finance of IPSX. Now, we can't imagine financing such a huge company is exactly cheap. And so how did you go about that and getting that initial startup capital? Because understandably, you'd need to finance all of the regulation, the systems, and any other things that come with it, such as financial licensing.
Yeah, no, it's definitely true. I mean, it's not a big company yet. I hope it will be a very big company in due course. But as I said, the problem here is you have to build it before anyone turns up. And I think it was quite a humbling experience for me, truthfully, to turn around from previously advising companies on how they should raise finance to actually being in the hot seat myself. And frankly, with just a piece of paper saying, look, I've got a jolly good idea. How about you give me some money for this? And so it's difficult, is the truth. It is very difficult to raise money off just a piece of paper. And obviously the quality of the idea is part of it. But I think, and this is not me talking about myself in particular, is it's actually about conviction on the individual who is driving this. So great idea, a gap, a real need for something, as we said before, but it's about being somebody who can compel somebody else to part with hard-earned cash to invest in something which is, by definition, a risky proposition of some sort. So for me, the answer to that was friends, former clients. Fortunately, in the financial services world, they've sort of normally done relatively well, so that was sort of fine. Government schemes that help you to do this in a tax-efficient way, that's very helpful as well. And then I finally got the little break that hopefully everybody gets, which was, in my case, the Daily Mail Group, somewhat surprisingly, was the first institutional investor in IPSX. And you say, well, what on earth is the Daily Mail, which does newspapers, doing in a financial services business? And the answer was that actually they had a very substantial business in B2B data in real estate in North America. And what they were looking for was eventually the data that came off this. Because again, real estate is a sector which has a lot of data, but it is always in the private domain, so it's not shared externally. And therefore people who are making investment decisions don't have access to that data to try and calibrate where they might think something is on the quality scale.
I think you mentioned already that starting a business obviously is great, but you need to understand that you're solving a problem. And the problem that you were solving with IPSX was that people weren't able to invest essentially into buildings and infrastructure. And so now you've given them the opportunity to do that. How are you seeing people actually taking that opportunity and investing their money into the stock exchange?
Well, it's still early days. I mean, the journey has been 7 or 8 years, something like that already, again, because you have to build the thing before you can actually start to put into the market. And as I say, people are slow to change behavior patterns, unfortunately. So no matter how much you explain to them this is a much better answer, it takes time for some of these things to evolve. So our market is mostly actually institutional money at the moment. So the IPOs here are firstly of single, rather large buildings or many buildings that have commonality. And again, this is about the ability to really understand what you're getting. At the risk of diverging again a little bit, is buildings give you cash, and I think every investment that anybody does should really be rooted in, well, will I ever get any cash out of this investment? Because that's what we think we're looking for. And what's my belief as to the risk attached to the cash from coming to me? And that's where, of course, there have been many changes over the last or recent years in particular about certain businesses getting a lot of money that haven't got any cash coming out of them. In fact, they are quite the reverse. They are sucking in huge amounts of cash to feed the burn in those early stage businesses. But what we are doing at IPSX is we're basically democratizing access to this asset class by virtue of a regulated market, which brings all the protections to investors that a normal stock exchange, because it is a normal stock exchange, it is simply focusing on the fact that it is real estate as an asset class and people being able to understand what those assets actually are.
To just touch back on the financing aspect, so obviously you mentioned that you're in the hot seat now because you need to finance your own company. And in today's times, obviously financing is much more difficult because of high interest rates. And so with Wyvern, your experience at Wyvern, when companies have to face high interest rates and the prospect that financing their deals is more difficult, what's your strategy in advising them? I mean, some banks look for clients with excess dry powder, so lots of money in their balance sheet, or perhaps a quality deal that makes a lot of sense in the long term. But what's been Wyvern's strategy to tackle how hard financing is right now?
Well, there's no doubt whatsoever that financing is difficult at the moment, is the first thing. And I guess you've got to look at the two simple components. One is the debt market, and obviously we've seen certain things happening in the banking market in recent weeks. But the availability of debt at the moment is still much less available than it was before, and of course it is much more expensive than it was before. On the equity side, I think people are just being very, very cautious at the moment. It's not a great time to go out for a new business at the moment to get that venture capital, that very early stage money, because people are being sensitive. Equally, it is not a great time to go and do fantastically huge buyout transactions. So we do a number of buyout transactions. So these are the leverage buyouts. I don't like calling them leverage buyouts because they're not necessarily leveraged. There's a perception in the world externally that private equity is all greed, horrible, terrible, destructive stuff. I clearly don't believe that. In every industry, I suspect there are people who are sort of like rogue actors, if you want. So I'm sure you could probably say that about private equity. But the issue at the moment is that many of the returns that are expected from the ultimate investors in these transactions are impaired or can't be reached on a base case unless there's a certain amount of debt put into those deals. So you either buy cheap, that's the only thing that you can do at the moment, or you hang on. The dynamics, though, are very clear, which is there's a lot of dry powder. You mentioned dry powder. So there's $2 trillion worth of private equity dry powder at the moment. This, for anyone who just checking on dry powder is the amount of money that is raised by private equity funds that hasn't yet been spent. So in other words, it's sitting there, it's in the pocket, it's burning a very, very big hole in those pockets. And the investors, of course, want this money spent because if it's not spent, they're not going to get any returns out of it. So there's a terrible dynamic here, which is people trying to push this money into the market to go and do deals. The people who are selling their businesses think their businesses are worth much more than actually anybody wants to buy them. So you have a very big gap in expectations between buyers and sellers. The only place where you don't have that gap, which is quite interesting, and I'm an advocate of public companies as well as private companies, is in the stock market. So at the moment what you have is companies on public markets with low valuations, and intrinsically they are worth a heck of a lot more than that. And so again, anyone who reads the financial pages will know that there are a mass of companies that are being bought out by private equity because the price that is being offered for these companies in the public markets is so low that they can afford to pay a very substantial premium to buy those businesses without necessarily putting too much debt into it either. So they get their returns by virtue of paying less for those good businesses than they might otherwise do. But it's tough. The good news is, I think, and this is based on a very, very tiny sample, which is my own firm, is we certainly get a sense that the activity is increasing. So I'm hopeful, again, that the situation that we have at the moment is very different to the situations that we've had in previous downturns, financial downturns. And I think it's really just, again, it's people getting comfortable with what is the reality as opposed to things that they didn't really understand. The COVID situation was also very different because although we all got locked up in different ways, the financial services industry wasn't affected. The only thing that happened was any transaction that related to somebody who has to rely on consumers to be able to go to the particular business, that just disappeared. But it was pretty short. And in fact, the other thing that I think is quite interesting is if we want to be a little bit more positive about life, which I think we should, is if you map out, over the last sort of 100 years or so, the performance of something like the stock market, so the index of just the UK stock market, the US one, all the same, it is basically a straight line, okay? So if you look at it that way, again, you wonder, is there something cataclysmic that's going to come at some point that really takes it down? But the history sort of suggests that many of the interruptions to the financial services world are pretty transitory. They're not more than a year or maybe 18 months. And again, I think it's about people just getting comfortable with what the risks are as opposed to anything that's fundamental. And I'd include in that the runs on some of the US banks, which are very difficult to understand at the moment. And as we were talking a little bit earlier, is JP Morgan cannot buy all the other banks in the US. So I hope that does come to a nice close soon.
You mentioned the private equity industry and how they work in the financial markets. And I wanted to ask you, the private equity world doesn't exactly have the best of reputations. You hear about it in the news pretty negatively quite a lot of the time and very rarely in a positive light. Would you agree with a lot of what the newspapers say about private equity in general, or would you say that actually private equity is there to put value into economies and put value into countries?
So it's, as I said, I think there isn't an industry on the planet that doesn't have bad folk there. And making substantial profits, some of which are beyond the scope of most people on the planet, drives behavior patterns which sometimes are clearly wrong on that. On the other hand, I also think that private equity just happens to be the label for private finance today. And so, again, if we go back to hundreds of years, families were what would have been the private equity folk of hundreds of years ago. They would have been sending ships off to different parts of the world to go and collect things, sometimes, again, not behaving beautifully in the countries that they were visiting. So if you want, it's history repeating itself in that sense. What I think is true, though, is that without private equity, a lot of the economy would suffer, truthfully. The public markets are volatile generally. They shouldn't be for certain things, so real estate should not be a volatile asset class, but equities can be volatile. And again, if you have businesses which are high-tech businesses which as I mentioned earlier on, grow very fast in the early years, but also run the risk of collapsing very quickly at some point in the future, and they happen to be public companies, that causes problems for people. So it's difficult. I think there are certain things which even the private equity industry think should change, certainly around taxation of some of the personal gains in private equity. That's something that is being pursued or is habitually pursued in the States, and I notice that it's in the narrative of the UK press as well at the moment. But I do think that private equity is maligned unfairly in many cases, and that's why I'm nervous about using this term leveraged buyouts, because they're not always leveraged, and indeed they're not all buyouts. So in other words, that's a control deal. There's a lot of money. In fact, most of the money recently has been going into growth transactions. To pick up, Kizar, on the comment that you were making, is the fact that if you haven't got debt, then what you really do is you invest in businesses that have embedded growth in them, and you help those businesses to evolve. And so that's why growth equity has increased. But because those deals are smaller deals typically than many of the mature businesses, then the dry powder that we were talking about before is not being used as fast because the check sizes are somewhat smaller.
So to turn to Wyvern's sort of M&A activities, as I mentioned that you look for certain sectors, so in the media and fintech, why do you go after these sectors? What's your outlook for them in the future, and do they have something in common? I know that one of Wyvern's strategies is to target companies that have innovative disruption.
Yeah, I love the word disruption. I love it because it's not just about technology. Sometimes it is about technology, but it's also about doing things differently. And you'll probably see the theme here is really about the fact that you need to reboot. This discipline of private equity ownership is really interesting because they have to invest and then they have to come out to prove the return to their investors over a period of time. And so this is good because every time that happens, there's a new business plan that you need to reboot, and you need to think about the next phase of development for those businesses. So disruption, we love those businesses because they're exciting, they're interesting, they're growth businesses, and we do also do lots of the more conventional stuff as well, so older businesses and consumer businesses. So it just so happens I have a love of disruption, and I think it's a great market to focus on.
So the investment banking sector is quite well known to be very saturated. If you walk into Mayfair, you could probably find an investment bank on every street corner. And so growing Wyvern from its roots, from basically nothing, how have you grown the company to then be working with clients that are offering you deals that are amassing to over £1 billion and that have led your total net value to 65 billion?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think in a way we're very fortunate. We have a model which says advice is important. And again, I touched on this slightly earlier, which is somebody who is making a decision, be it somebody who is a corporate CEO or in many cases the owner of the business, it's the most important thing that's going to happen in their life, at least financially. And so the decision making there has to be as good as it possibly can be. And I draw the distinction between generating lots of information and then handing it over to the client and say, here's the information, why don't you make the decision on this? But that's not what they want. What they want is somebody who will sit there and say, I think you should do this, and this is why you should be doing this. At the risk of being negative in some cases around investment bankers, I think there is too much of the data dump and less of the advice. That's what this is really about, is about advice and judgment. And so one of the things that we actively encourage at Wyvern is for all our partners to have external interests. Because if they have external interests, then they are more likely to be able to give advice because they've lived it themselves. And there's no badge of, and I have the badge of dishonor, and my wife sometimes reminds me about this, is, we have made investments that have gone wrong. And the only way that you can really understand how you should be advising somebody in the right way is if you've earned the gold star, or maybe it's not a gold star, for doing deals where it doesn't quite go to plan. And of course, nearly everything doesn't go to plan in some shape or form. The one thing that we can guarantee when somebody gives us a business plan is it's never going to be like that. We all know that, which makes you wonder why you spend so much time doing the modeling on this, since it's never going to be like that. Of course, you can look at different sensitivities on it. But I think that people have gone back in time to a certain extent to appreciate a personalized service where somebody who, if you want, has a breadth of experience in a particular piece of the pie, because we're never going to be as good as understanding their business as they are, but in terms of doing transactions, we've seen a lot. There's always a horrible moment in every transaction where, at least in my experience, it dies. And at that point you think, oh dear. But you know that it hasn't really died. And in some cases you make it die because you have to make the other side understand that they're not going to get more or less out of this. So we're going to walk away. At which point normally the client is saying, are you sure that we should be walking away? What if they don't come back to us? And of course that is a bit of a tough call to make. But I think it's all about personalized service is the bottom line, and experience to genuinely advise.
So, in terms of entrepreneurship, one of the biggest challenges for any entrepreneur is navigating a saturated industry. And as Zach mentioned, the IB industry, especially with boutiques right now, there's a lot popping up. And if we take a sector that you're interested in, for example, fintech, there are so many boutiques pouncing on fintech. Fenchurch is pretty big, FTP Partners have their whole speciality. And they all promise essentially the same thing: honest, independent advice and speciality in the sector. So how do you go about differentiating yourself in an industry like this?
Yeah, you're right. Everyone says honest, independent advice. They do all say that. I don't think you can explain it other than by reputation. And I think one of the things that, going back to the track record, we were overjoyed when we did our first deal in 2002 and put it, rather sadly, alone on the website. Because we had to show that we'd done something. And equally, there's no point just saying, oh, but I did millions of deals back in Lehman Brothers and all the other banks that I worked at. You have to do it independently. And it's tough, is the truth, to get that first one. But of course, things move. There's a momentum that comes. And we're not good at advertising. I think we do have the words honest, independent advice. I'm now a bit worried that that's what we do say. Perhaps because we do give honest, independent advice. But it is a saturated market. But again, it's what people want. And so different people want different types of service. And industry expertise is very good as well. And we certainly have areas of expertise where we have just done everything in the market for that. But also diversity is important because you learn from other types of transactions. And this goes not just to making the judgment call, but also, could I apply the financing structure that was used on this deal to a completely different industry? So it drives, if you want, to innovation, which is another thing which is really important, is how do you deal with it? If anything, the people who are successful, I think, are experts at solving problems, because it's problem after problem after problem. And if they're good at that, they'll be very successful in their banking businesses. But it's true, by the way, that a lot of people will not do anything with these smaller firms because they want the comfort of one of the very big banks to be able to give them the excuse that if these people said it, then of course it must be right.
To continue the story a bit on both IPSX and Wyvern, you mentioned previously that you have obviously made some investments that haven't gone your way, and understandably you would have lost money on those. But what other hurdles have you faced in both the companies that you founded, and what hurdles do you think you will continue to face?
I think the biggest hurdles are really about making your mark in the industry. One of the things that we debated when we started the Wyvern business was whether or not we resurrected a brand that had existed in the past and used that to sort of trade off. And actually, because we'd all come from the same place, and we thought, actually, they had some old brands that we could probably buy in some way, and maybe we could use them. And we came to the conclusion, actually, it was better to start off with a clean sheet of paper and just start to build your reputation from scratch, which gave a greater emphasis to the people as opposed to the brand. In a way, again, it's talking about the big bank versus smaller bank type thing. All businesses are challenging. One of the things that I learned at IPSX when I somewhat, I guess, naively thought that I could be chairman of the company and therefore just dip in and out and sort of do things is you can't do that. And being a manager of a business, which is a different subject, is a very, very difficult job to do. And I don't think unless you have had the challenge of being a manager that you really appreciate what people have to go through to actually be successful in a business. And what I mean by that is I say as bankers we solve problems, but we solve problems relating to deals. But management teams in companies solve problems which at one level seem tiny. Somebody in the team irritated because they haven't got the right pay, or they need to go on holiday, or they're not very good, or whatever. But the skill set to be able to manage those constant interruptions and to drive an agenda to get people in the right place and to lead them is genuinely a very, very important skill. And I think that differentiates a successful business. I mean, obviously, if you've got the bad model, then you're in trouble. But if you don't have the right management team, even with a great model, you're in a lot of trouble going forward.
And just as a last question from me, you've talked a lot about sort of the need for entrepreneurs and the hurdles that you've faced on your own journey as an entrepreneur. And I think everyone can accept that entrepreneurship, while important, isn't for everyone. And one of the biggest challenges when you have an idea is understanding, am I capable enough to make this a reality? And people have different advice. They say, just do it, or no, plan it and consult people and then decide whether you should do it. What's your view on that? If you have an idea and someone came to you and said, should I do this, should I plan it, how should I take myself forward with this, what would you say to them?
I encourage everyone to be an entrepreneur, truthfully. Not necessarily because they have to build a business, but I think it is part of human nature, and it evolves the individual. There's a philosophy about the telic and the atelic journey. So from the Greek telos, which is a goal, and so what this is trying to differentiate between should you be enjoying, if you have a goal, let's put it this way, if you have a goal and you want to be, let's just say, why you would, I don't know, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, if you want to be Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, that's your goal. Now, unfortunately, maybe fortunately, there are a few vacancies. In recent years, a few more vacancies. But if you fail to do that, then you're very disappointed, okay? If you succeed in doing that, actually, you're also disappointed, because once you've done that, what do you do the next day? Now, my ambition has gone. And so the emphasis, and I think this goes exactly to the point of being an entrepreneur, is the journey is what you really need to focus on, which is the ability to continuously enjoy. And I think entrepreneurial people enjoy what they do. Whether or not it's successful or not really the point. But it is the human state to be able to enjoy this journey, because no matter where you get to, you've enjoyed all the journey, and you're not judging yourself right at the back end of it. And I think, Zachary, you might remember that I also talk about this thing about infinite and finite games. So this is another philosophical one, which is just saying, it's similar in a way, which is saying, if you just plan for something, you are more likely to fail, because nothing ends up in the way that you want it to. So again, is just build something and see where it goes. But I always have, as I say, right at the beginning, entrepreneurs are top of the food chain for me, because they're giving it a go. in however small or big way it's done. So you don't actually have to go and start a business. It's this mindset, the application of everything that you have around you to build a better world. I know that sounds a bit dramatic, but it truthfully is. If we don't have people who want to do things which are different, and even before we started this podcast, some fascinating discussions about things that should be done elsewhere, not just on this planet, but elsewhere. And I'm not talking about little green folk at this point. That's fantastic. I love that.
We'd like to ask you that if you started from scratch again today, knowing what you know from founding Wyvern and the IPSX group, what would you do differently?
Gosh. So fortunately, with Wyvern, there were three of us, so we helped each other on the journey, and maybe that is something which is helpful. It can be quite lonely doing this alone. No matter how bright you are, no matter how driven you are, you need somebody to be able to bounce your thinking off, and that might be a partner, it might be a friend, it might be business colleagues as you go forward. And I think there, again, is unfortunately, and I'm fortunate that I didn't see this, but I do know that in many of these businesses that you start up, people who were very close friends and embark on something, it all falls apart, differing views. So, and it's pretty hard, but you need to choose the people who you're going on the journey with. Or you can do it alone, but I think that's a very, very lonely path to go on.
Thank you so much for your time, Anthony. It's been a pleasure to speak to you and hear your advice and your journey and experiences, and also your insights into these industries in which you're an expert.
I'd like to thank you all for attending this session of this podcast. This session has provided a fascinating glimpse into the life of a successful investment banker. Question mark? Exclamation mark.
Keep the question mark.
Deal maker and serial entrepreneur. What was particularly interesting was Anthony's insights into the challenges of starting a business, and especially some of the more subtle and intangible skills required for success. Building a business is not easy, and it's not for everyone. But for those that make it, it can be one of the most rewarding experiences in life. With that said, we'd like to present Anthony with a token of our appreciation.